All right. So I've actually deleted the questions we've gone over, and some I've added or changed after because I reread it, obviously.
Yeah.
So do you think it's the difference we notice first when we're differentiating and integrating? Obviously, the order is differentiate and
Yes.
integrate, but you do think it's the difference?
Yeah.
Okay, because when you have a group of chairs, and I guess you're comparing them to tables, you are noticing the shape is different, and then somehow you unite them by their similarity.
Yeah. I mean, it is a somehow. It's not like, say, if we're, well, looking at this part, it's talking about a child. Just keep that context in mind. It's just when a child observes two objects, it's just, I mean, to notice two objects, you have to differentiate that somehow as just
Yeah,
distinct things.
yeah,
So you do that, and once you get this set of stuff, like, I don't know, five objects around you, then you can start comparing them, find their resemblances. I mean, that's really all that's happening here. You're like, you have a bunch of things, you distinguish them as individual things, and you're just looking at their similarities.
right. Yeah. I guess also logically, it makes sense that you need to differentiate something from a background in order to then look for a similarity.
Yeah,
Hmm.
and that's why just the page before she was talking about you need an existent first, like
Yes.
the three stages, like you begin with this existent, the thing itself, the thing you see, the sensation, and then it goes to the second stage, which is uh, just yeah, just first noticing things as they are, then distinguishing them, and then noticing that there's relationships. I mean, you need to first identify things, then recognize that things have identity,
I
and
was
then
trying
from
to
there you can get similarities.
I was trying to think in my head of like, okay, let's say I'm a child and I see all these entities around me, and let's say there's a table and two chairs or three chairs, or like let's say there's um, just to kind of make it simple. Let's say there's three tables and two chairs, something like that.
Yeah,
And then I'm like, I see all these shapes in front of me, and then in order for me though to differentiate, like I can't, it's not a mental process of me going, oh, something is different about those chairs, because that would mean I've already identified similarities. It would somehow have to
yeah,
be like, um, you hold on to one item at a time, right? Like you're like, big thing, big thing, big thing. So table. And
yeah,
then suddenly you go to chair and you're like, oh, not same as other big things, different. And then you go to other one, not same as other chair, not same as other big things, different, but same to other small things, something like that, right?
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's nothing too complicated. I mean, there are children here; they're not going anything really complicated. It's just there's
Yeah.
things. Then once you see things, you might recognize they do things. Things do things,
Yeah.
so they have an identity. They cause things. Things happen, and then once you start saying they cause things, Rand is supposing that you can find a relationship that red things cause them to red things roll or something like that. Like you can connect that there's a relationship among all these objects.
Right. And we
But
can, yeah, go on. Sorry.
yeah, I mean you're just going through that just and that's the kind of similarities you're trying to notice, or at least that's what Rand is suggesting is going on.
The,
That we've noticed these things happening, you just associate it, or maybe not associate, but recognizes a relationship to the thing that's acting.
um, when you notice these things, do you mean like recognize that it's related? Because you said causes, something causes. Like I never understood, like green causes something. Like the cause and effect sounds pretty complex to me. I think scientific, but when I think of like, is the texture of a table a cause? Is that
Um, I think Rand would be supposing largely that this is how you can. Yeah, I mean, maybe you might suppose it is, because it causes the sensation even. It causes, I mean,
Oh,
something
okay.
about it might strike your mind or might strike you as relevant or very apparent to you. Like color is very apparent. So children do use that a lot to suppose it causes something to happen or makes it's what makes up a relationship. Like red things do this or blue things do that.
Yeah. Um, and the similarities and differences are, I guess, also cause uh, and have an effect on our means of perception. Like
Yeah.
you know, blue and red have a different effect on your perception. So that in that sense, like I can see, so does texture has a different effect on your sensation. So that the texture is a cause in a way, but it's kind of confusing to think about it that way.
Yeah, but I'm sure a kid would be a little confused with just the idea here being that first you recognize things, then you recognize that they have an identity, and then you recognize that they have a relationship among other stuff. Like you might notice a relationship between red things and tasting sweet, as in apples are red and they
Yeah.
taste sweet. So you might create a relationship like that based on already recognizing the other two things. It's really working on implicitly that you begin with existence, existence, the things in front of you. And that's just the fundamental stuff that we can create an epistemology out of this. We can work with something here. Whether or not the kid recognizes it as the concept existent is beside the point. It's really that he has some basic understanding of there's things and things have identity. Things
Yeah.
do stuff. It doesn't need to be much more complicated than that. And we can validate it just even by observing children to the extent that they can respond to colors once you demonstrate a certain relationship, like
Yeah.
or they can recognize these relationships that they can distinguish what an object is. And even earlier on in their development, like they could distinguish objects, but they might seem like unable to make any relationship out of things. They might not recognize that round things roll. I mean, they might
Right.
not be able to get to there, but they recognize that there are things and there's things that are round.
Right. Mm. Do you make any difference between? Do you make any distinction between existent and entity? Is that different? Because it sounds like the same thing to me.
It's on the perceptual level is the same. She uses a term really to distinguish like concepts or existence because they're things, but they're not concrete. They're not perceptual. You don't sense them with your senses. So she just says
Ah.
existence are the anything that exists, but they
Ah.
could be
Okay.
perceptual. They could be non-perceptual.
Got it.
Entities are perceptual.
Ah. Okay. Mental. So you can't have a mental entity. You can have a mental existent. Ah, it's just the distinction to help with that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
She does use the word mental entity, but she does say it's more metaphorical. So
Yeah.
she clarifies that it's not literally it's not
Got
an
it.
entity.
Sure. And I can understand there's a need sometimes in philosophy to have that kind of precision, just like you've got cognition and thinking.
Yeah.
All right. I understood the CCD finally. I read that. I had to read that quite a bit and very slowly, but I get it. This part says, I get that you pick a standard of measurement that is, you have to perceive it and it has to be immutable, so unchangeable. Otherwise, like what, if you can't be in flux, otherwise you're not, one measurement is
Yeah.
something and a different measurement, you get a different measurement another time. How does that work with emotion though? I know it's a bit covered in the other, it's just covered in the other chapter because like,
Yeah.
yeah, okay, we'll
I
skip
think
it
in
then.
chapter 4 it's covered.
Yeah, okay. I did see there was one on emotion. I was just curious when I read this. I was like, how do you get an immutable standard for that? But that's covered. So
It is difficult with things like that. I think you could question Rand on some concepts. Just do all concepts get formed based on a quantitative measurement? I mean, emotions, she really just says they're measured on intensity.
right.
What exactly is intensity? I mean, that's where it can be vague, and I'm almost wondering if you could have just an on-off identity about that. But anyway, that's really more in-depth analysis of criticizing our theory. I mean, the main idea here is that Rand proposes that there's a measurement for all concepts.
Yeah. This may have been, I may have forgot this and it's from the previous one. So let me just check if these questions are still relevant. Okay, that bit I understand. We did speak about that. I think this is an odd question. Actually, so I'll cross out this one because we did talk about that.
Yeah.
Would you say the essence of definition is the identification of the genus?
How does Rand define it? Doesn't she say in that chapter? I don't quite remember. Oh yeah. Definitions provide words with identity.
Is the identification, is identity to genus? Like, all I know is genus is like family. Because it gives you the relationship to everything else, right? Isn't that the...
Yeah, I mean, it is genus and species. That's the
so
way
it's
Rand...
got to be both. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's a definition will satisfy those requirements. That's the better way to phrase it, that a proper definition will have the genus and the differentia in it. And you can't observe that really in any definition you look up in the dictionary. It seems what it's related to and then what makes it unique. I mean, that's just a principle of developed a long time ago, just of making definitions. And ever since like the classification of animals, like only from kingdom to species, I mean, it's just based on those kind of ideas that that's the proper way to define something. It's precise enough and it's clear enough.
Right. And it keeps everything connected.
Yes. And that's what would be like a proper definition would be that way. You can talk about it differently, but a definition really just provides a word with identity that you can distinguish it as unique and or not necessarily unique, but you can identify that word as referring to something. It's like adding precision to your concept. If you can define it, you pretty much have a good sense of your definition or a good sense of your concept.
Yeah, and provided you've also got examples in your head, right?
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember in that before she mentioned definition, she goes on about needing perceptual concretes,
right?
A symbolic thing, and the definition. I mean, you have your symbol, and the definition gives identity to that symbol. That it's not just arbitrary anymore. That it actually refers to something.
Yeah.
That's really what the definition does. It converts that symbol into something of meaning, of conceptual meaning.
Yeah. We spoke about there being a distinction between existent entity to identify that entity is a thing external to can be directly perceived. Is that what it was? And then existent can include mental. What do you call them? Mental things.
Yeah.
Okay. So in that case, when we talk about actions, qualities, relationships, are they all? Is there difference? Is there a kind of precision in the way you think about this? Like, would you just say they're attributes of entities or within entities, or like, is there some kind of like haggling over the way you describe attributes?
Yeah, that's characteristics of entities would make sense, I think, because you don't want to say they're in entities because that's almost saying like they're distinct things that they somehow have an independent identity. Like,
Sorry.
you're not looking for them within it. It's just they're aspects of entities. I mean, the entity is the one that's doing it. The entity is the one with the identity, but you can just narrow it down like an aspect of it. Like you're identifying some particular way its identity functions.
There's no difference between any of those, right? Attributes, aspects, characteristics.
Yeah,
I've got to look them up.
pretty much interchangeable.
Yeah.
I've used them as synonyms.
Okay, cool. So this one, I reread this, and okay, so she's saying, she's talking about the act of isolation is what's called the process of abstraction. It's a selective mental focus, so we can separate out certain attributes from the others, like color
Yeah.
or shape. And the uniting, so then the identification of the similarity and the uniting of the things we've taken out selectively is not a mere sum, but an integration, a blending of the units into a single new mental entity, which is used thereafter as a single unit of thought. And then later, right after, she says, in order to be used as a single unit, the enormous sum integrated by the concept. So I'm a bit confused. Like, on the one hand, she's saying it's not a sum, but then she's saying the enormous sum integrated. So like, what's this precision about? Like, what's this sum and blend? To me, that I can't tell what I don't get why what's the difference.
Well, I think she's saying there that it begins, you could say it's a sum to start, and it is then integrated. I mean, it's more than a sum once it is integrated. I mean, I think you could say you have a sum of stuff around you. But you have to integrate it into a whole. If there's just a sum of stuff, it's just like there's, I don't know, imagine there's cube like blocks all around you, and in a mess, you just put them together into together.
Okay.
But
Because
it's
when
not
I think,
integrated yet. You have to then integrate it. There's some mental process you need to go to integrate it into a whole entity, into a whole mental existent.
because it's what I thought sum was. I thought sum, when you go 5 plus 6 plus 7 plus 8 plus 9 or whatever, and then you go
Yeah.
equals, then that the sum is what you get after adding all those. So that's like a final number. And that's how I thought of it. But she just means all the separate components.
Yeah, I mean, a sum is just like the individual pieces, but when she's saying it's not just a blend, it's not merely putting things together like so they're touching your. It's not like just putting a mess of blocks in your room and just putting them into
Okay.
one
Got it.
pile.
I
I mean, that would
understand.
be like a sum. Like you got one
Yes.
block, 2 block, 3 block, add them together into a stack, and you got three. But it's more like you add them together, but then you blend them in such a way that it's a whole in your mind. That's what the concept is. You blended it into a single whole.
Or I guess maybe the analogy, or obviously it's always dangerous when you get into like analogies and metaphors, but like if you take all the numbers, all the sums, it's like you're trimming pieces off that are not relevant or something like that,
More
like
or
the
less.
material of the chair, and then you're combining them that way.
Yes, that's part of what goes on. Yes,
Okay,
you're
cool.
removing from focus certain details, and that's what measurement omission is. Like it has a length or it has a size, but it doesn't matter what particular size it is.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so this bit is about, she's talking about the concept of table and how we form it and identify the similarities being the flat support and flat level support and supports underneath that. Okay, and then she's later saying, observe, however, that the utilitarian requirements of the table set certain limits on the omitted measurements in the form of no larger than, no smaller than required by its purpose. This rules out a 10-foot tall or 2-inch tall table, though the latter may be subclassified as a toy or a miniature table, and it rules out unsuitable materials such as non-solids. So we don't, when we unite, like there's some things that are implicit as well, like they're not in the definition, but they're implied. Like I assume that there's obviously a range of acceptable sizes. And so that part is kind of like implicit. We don't discuss that. It's just, you just know that, okay, it's about, in your head, you just sort of retain it's about that much, but it can't be more than that much. Is that how it works?
Well,
Like with any concept, there's a range of measurements which we don't explicitly identify.
I think it's a little different than that. In this instance, as far as the table, there's no, you can't have a liquid table, a water table that supports things. Like it doesn't matter. You can imagine it maybe, but if you ever did it, would just, the object would fall through. it
Yeah.
wouldn't be a table, no matter
Yeah.
how much you tried it to make it that way. Whether or not you realize that tables need to be solid, I mean, you would never end up creating a table that's liquid. It's just the nature of these requirements. I mean, just by being utilitarian, it's just the it just doesn't end up that way. It couldn't. Even if you wished it to be, you couldn't. So in that sense, it's defined by reality itself in a way. You can't determine for yourself what supports or doesn't, just that there are things that do support. As in water can't do it. I don't know, like paper couldn't do it. Things like that.
But you don't specify the range like that. That's implicit.
Right. Yeah, you wouldn't need to specify the range. Only that there is a range. That's really what the CCD usually is, that there is a range
Right.
of measurements.
And that part is like, obviously we don't need to consciously think about that. That part is just sort of worked out.
Yeah, you can investigate it further, of course, and come to realize that supports imply certain things about physics or about material science or about, I don't know, furniture design, things like that. You might discover that later. But as far as forming the concept initially, you got a thing supports at a range of sizes. And that's really what all the child really needs to have the concept formed. And then they learn the word table. They say table, and you could say they have formed the concept.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose the implied is it fits into a house. And then once you get outside of a certain range, you might think table, but you start questioning. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I got the CCD is just her term for the commensurable characteristic. And so I was wondering so in this case, she's talking about tables differentiated from chairs, beds, and other objects. CCD is shape. Does the CCD always become the distinguishing characteristic? Like the thing selected within the CCD, I mean. So let's say in this case, shape, the CCD is shape, and I don't know so shape is the thing that differentiates tables. And so does that mean that's the distinguishing characteristic? Because then their particular kind of shape is set as the distinguishing characteristic of tables. So in this case it is, but I'm wondering, is it always the case that it's like that?
I mean, if it is a common denominator, well, it might maybe not
Copied
necessarily.
this, by the way, from another section, which may be relevant.
Measurements with. It's not necessarily. I mean, things could still share different concepts in common. Like things could share color and shape. They could both share a shape.
Oh, okay.
It might not necessarily be distinguishing, but but all distinguishing characteristics are CCDs.
Okay, got it. But not all CCDs are distinguishing characteristics.
Yeah, it might not be. I mean, it could be something in common, but you might want something more abstract then. I mean, it might indicate that it's a really abstract concept you're thinking with. Because if things have shape and color and size in common, it might fit a more general category. But if there's only color in common, you might suppose it's a very specific kind of thing. You have to look for a very specific kind of measurement.
So remember we're talking about the first thing you notice is the differences in order to be able to identify this is different from that, and then you look for the similarity. But what about into wider categories like chair, table, sofa? Like I don't see how in that case, I don't know how you notice. Wouldn't you notice first the similarities in that case? Like chair, thing in house, table, thing in house for humans, sofa, thing. That's Oh, furniture, but that's a noticing of similarities, not differences first.
I don't think you necessarily have to go one way or the other. I just think it's usually differentiation. But I think when you get to more abstract things, it could really go either way. Because once you get to furniture, you don't. I mean, you do see furniture, but it's not. It's more a little more abstract than chair, or sofa,
Yeah,
or bed.
yeah.
It, doesn't she talk about furniture in that
Probably in
section?
abstractions from abstractions, not in this
It
one.
might
I
be
haven't
actually.
I'm going to it. Yeah.
Yeah, she does specifically use that example about furniture.
Yeah, all these examples of furniture. So I've gone with it. Um,
Yeah, but
let's
but
see.
you're right. I mean, you could notice. I think once you're going to wider categories like that, that might be a case where you notice similarities first.
Right.
But you still, it would have helped to begin with those differences of the different objects first, like the chairs, the tables. But then you could recognize the similarity among all of those things. What's the conceptual common denominator among chairs, tables, and beds? You could say like household items
Right.
could be the general category. And
Right.
that's kind of like, and maybe the measurement could be like, relation to human size, like a ratio of some kind or a proportion. Like furniture needs to be proportional to human size, and maybe that could be the CCD. But it really is just a matter of creativity or even thinking what the CCD is.
Well, I just had a thought now. Maybe you would notice the difference first because you've got to identify that there are things inside a house and things outside, and like some things you put
Yeah,
in and you sit on and you do things with, and they're different from the things outside. And then only then, and like different from the cutlery and different from the, like you've got to notice, you've got to be able to distinguish between all of those because otherwise
right.
everything is like, so maybe there is. It's really hard to tell. Like you've almost got to introspect and then
I
you,
think it could
you
go
just,
either way. Either way, you're doing both. You got to do both if you're going to make a concept. So
right.
in the end, it doesn't matter which
Yeah.
particular order you go, as long as you end up in the same place. I mean, it really depends. Like, where are you? Where do you grow up? When if you live in a teepee, like in the 1400s in North America, you're not going to notice things the same way.
Yeah.
As opposed if you grew up in Germany and Europe in the 1400s, there are houses that you live inside where you might actually need to make that distinction.
So you're saying chronology is context dependent. So it could be similarities,
Yeah.
it could be differences.
Yeah, you might be focused on the outside stuff first if you grew up in a nomad culture versus living in the city in in the 1400s or even today.
I'm trying to abstract away from the thought that, like if there's something in the sky and it's this rectangle and it's in the sky and it's the same color of the sky, if you can't differentiate it, then there's nothing to do with that. And I was thinking maybe that you can extrapolate from that and go, well, that must be the case from everything. If there are things and you can't differentiate them from other things in any significant way, then you can't even look for similarities. And so, that's a bit of a jump. I'm not really sure. I'm having trouble jumping from that to going, yes, 100% you have to get differences first. But
I mean, you got to distinguish it somehow.
yeah,
You need to know that it's not. I mean, that's why on some level, at some point, you need to differentiate. Yeah, you can do similarities first if you want. That's fine. But then you need to be able to differentiate at some point. Or if you do differentiate, you need to find similarities eventually. Otherwise, there's no point to make the concept, or there's no valid way to make a concept. It would be almost arbitrary or no cognitive function to do so.
no, but what I mean is that if you're not differentiating first, then how would you find this? Like, it's impossible to find a similarity, right? Because
Yeah,
how can you know, like, if I somehow can't tell that there are these things inside my house, chairs, tables, sofas, and they're like, I'm not thinking about them being any different from like a bench outside or a post or a TV, then how would I then, why? I don't know. It's hard to think about, but yeah, it's something I was
I mean, you're
just
probably right. I feel like there's some counterexample, but it's not
good.
coming to me. But
Yeah,
I don't think it'd be that big a deal even if I did. But I think you're right for the probably almost every case to be difference first, because I can't really imagine a case where you have you begin with just similarity, because what would you even be comparing to say is similar? You need to distinguish things before you say they're similar.
right,
Otherwise, they're the same thing. Like you
right.
see no difference. If you look at a blue mass in the sky that literally blends in, you can't perceive it. Then, well, yeah, you can't even.
You can't identify
There's
similarity.
nothing to identify or similar, no similarity and no difference either.
Yeah,
It's you might not even know it's there. If you did know it's there, well, you could differentiate it. There's some perceptual evidence on some level that exists. It could be like wind, like you see something else move, and that could be your perceptual kind of way of distinguishing. But unless you have, if you have nothing at all, it literally just blends in. Well, yeah, there's nothing to do. It's just nothing.
but and then what's interesting is I guess there's that on the perceptual level, but when you're talking about furniture, then you're getting to the you're no longer on purely perceptual level, and so
Right.
maybe in that case, it's not even a case of noticing as if your visual field presents you with the information, but it's a case of focusing and then identifying differences. So that's like a volitionally that's a
Yes.
volitional process. So it's different in that sense.
Yes. I mean, I think you're absolutely right on the perceptual level that you'll always start with differentiation on the perceptual level. That'll always happen. I don't even think it's possible otherwise. But once you get to the
Mm,
abstractions, then you could almost make up the differences in a way. It's really just a matter of what you focus on, what you abstract away, things like that. That's really what would determine
what
how
do you
you're
mean you
finding
could
similarities and differences.
make up the differences? Can you give me an example of
I
what do
mean,
you
you could
mean?
make up dragons and unicorns. That's kind of what I mean. Like you can imagine whatever characteristics you want sometimes.
So you can in at that point you're saying when you're abstract you can
That's
uh
when you can become
create.
detached. Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, you can become detached when that's when you use concepts you to stay grounded, you work with the perceptual level. That
Mm-hmm.
you're not going to start creating things based on absolutely nothing. Like you'll reason from perception on up. And if you are somehow just detached without any way to connect it to like similarities and differences or to reality itself, then it's not a valid concept.
Right. uh yeah, it makes sense. What you know, have you heard of the black swan problem,
Yes.
where
Yeah.
you see, I think it's something like you see black swans and you say all swans are black, but then you see a white swan and it completely like destroys your knowledge, or that's how the explanation goes, something like that, right? Did I get it right?
You got it backwards. The idea
Can
was
you
that people always saw white swans. Then we see a black swan, like, oh my God,
we have black
everything.
swans here, so
That's the idea actually. That's where it comes from. That in Europe they saw the white swans. Come to
right.
Australia, you see a black one. It's like, what do I do now? It's like
Yeah,
you just blows your mind.
I think I realized because I have this thing I'm preparing, this write up about like I'm getting stuck on this idea of like, how do I know something is true if I can't, like just because I can't find a counter example for something doesn't mean it's true. And then I thought, isn't that a bit like this? Doesn't that relate to this white swan problem or black swan problem? I don't know. Um, it's the same concept of like, I think I'm still holding these kind of like, what are they called? Omniscient knowledge premise or something like that. Because even in this case, like we're trying to think of an example of where, like you might identify similarity first, and I can't think of an example, but it doesn't mean that I'm 100% right about it always being a differentiator. Um, and then I was thinking about that actually. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but then I was thinking like, well, it's also true of men. Like if you say all men are mortal, it's not, I generally don't feel like any moment I might discover a man who's immortal and then all my knowledge will be flushed out. Right.
Right.
Um, and so in order to like, it's that question of how do you validate that something is true without continuously trying to find and being scared of finding a counterexample, well, that's got to be an induction, which is I don't have an answer to that. So I don't even know how that works. But like this whole thing of us finding like, okay, we can think of a few examples where it's you always identify the difference first. We can't think of anywhere we can identify a similarity first. And what happens on an abstract level? Do you identify similarities or differences first? We don't know. But then at what point can you say, like, yes, it's a validated induction?
The only reason I say maybe at that, because I think it has to do with science. Like you need a really specific analysis to know, because it's unclear enough that I don't think I can be sure now. But I'm sure enough that there is both. I can say for sure you differentiate and you find similarities.
Yeah, without.
You could leave open certain questions. That's why I think about, would it change anything if it were true? If it were true that you could never, you had to begin with differences first always, would it change anything? I don't think it would. It's interesting to think about as far as the precision of the claim and science and how the mind works, but it's not going to change as far as the general theory of how concepts are formed.
Yeah. She did say later that concept formation is a form of induction.
Yes.
Which is interesting. Okay, I guess I won't have an answer to that problem of mine anytime soon.
It's still the same question of contextual certainty. It gets into the same questions, same issues, same problems. Yeah. Like, how do I know this time it's going to be the same? But
yes,
it's really just working through what is contextual certainty. To what degree can you be certain? That's why we talked before about like define your boundaries of what it applies to. Just define your. We don't include too much, but don't include in too little. I know that's kind of vague, but that's really the idea of it. That if it's specific enough, you can't be wrong about it, because it's like this time, at this moment, at this day, this is always the case. But how you extend that context, make it wider and broader, that's the difficult part.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I guess with that example of like me thinking about differences first, I'm still not like it's if I could mentally recreate that experience and have come up with a few different examples, I might be more confident in saying yes, like you must always notice differences first, or no, it could be either. But because I'm not confident with the examples, maybe that's if you have more examples, it's because then you can, like you said, you can start with, okay, in this case, you definitely notice the difference first. In this case, you definitely notice the difference. And in this case, and then they're so dissimilar and what different examples that you're like, yes, all of them, you must notice the difference first. But I don't have that right now. So
yeah, in a way, that question is, you'd be getting ahead of yourself almost. Like, that's the whole question of doing this. Like, they're supposed to help you find that. Like, you're not going to find the answer to that. I think this is like, let me put it this way. Like, we can find the answer in terms of, like, we're getting at the theory, but you have to understand the entire book first, I think. In a fluid, deep way to really, that's what I mean, you're getting maybe a bit ahead of yourself, because that's the hard part of the question, and that's what you're probably trying to learn right now. That's the whole objective here, I think.
Okay.
And understanding I2, you'll get there, but you can't be there immediately. Got to go through all this first.
So this is cool. All adverbs have the genus motion or action, because I was trying to conceptually reorganize. And if this basically just helps me cut out, like make a million connections between different words, because I'm suddenly like everything that's an adverb is a kind of motion or an action, which would have probably taken me much longer to think about on my own.
Yeah.
And she gives quite a few others, like materials and prepositions, like kinds of relationships, which is it's like all of that has suddenly just been reduced.
Or just to be more precise than the previous one, it's not motion or action, characteristics of motion or action are adverbs.
What?
Verbs would be motion or action. adverbs, characteristics of motion.
Characteristics of motion. Yes. You're right. Absolutely. I got that wrong. Okay. This is, I know she's covering this later, but I'm curious, what is the meaning of this joke and how? What the hell is that?
I
Can you
think
measure
that's
love?
and how is such a weird phrase.
What
It's
is
just
that?
such a old way of speaking. It's just like I'll answer. Not only will I answer it, I will say how you can do it. But it's
Okay.
just a weird expression. Nobody
Yeah.
really talks that way anymore. It's just
Okay.
an antiquated
All right.
expression.
I was like, maybe there's some kind of like implicit thing in the combination of words, and I'm like, I was trying, and there's nothing there though. Okay, cool.
Yes.
This is I didn't go over this section, so this is going to be some random questions when I understood it less, and some may be repeats.
Yeah.
So when I read, I just reread the first two chapters, which I didn't get. But
Yeah.
so this will be less clarified, a bit more messy, but we can tackle it. Even though a child does not have to perform the feat of genius performed by some mind or minds in the prehistorical infancy of the human race, the invention of language, every child has to perform independently the feat of grasping the nature of language, the process of symbolizing how do we know what isn't a feat of genius? Have you given that any thought? Because I know that's a way different question than, like, how would you determine what?
I think it's just a way to just explain like that are incredible discoveries. It just, to me, it's just something that's incredible. That's amazing. I mean, what is or isn't, I guess it just depends on what impact it has on society or
Right.
what impact it has on a field. Like, I don't think of it any more than that.
Maybe the size of I think you mentioned the impact it has in terms of like the thinking, like it completely causes a rethinking in the field. Obviously,
Yeah,
language would cause that. So that would be one way to measure it. Okay. We talked about this. You can think like a child thinks in pictographic form, but it's limited. So we did speak about this.
Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting observation in psychology. Sometimes it seems like language is what enables a child to remember more. I mean, the reason you may be that you can't remember well, say when you're like 3 years old, you can't think that far back because you didn't, or maybe 2 years old, because you didn't have language to encode your memories. It's just they're images, they're not really
Right.
anything.
Right.
They're just, until you learn language, then it's hard to remember things in a
Right.
conceptual way. I mean, it's not that you don't remember anything, but you're not going to remember anything conceptual or these
Right.
events in your life.
Right. It's like Funes. He's just all images. Even his symbols are images because they're all unique.
Yeah, metaphorically, like him, but yeah.
Yeah, because even if it's just a different word, it's a different sound. So that's a different image, or it's an audio. Yeah. Okay.
But the child probably, before language, their symbols are probably much more primitive, if at all. Like, it's hard to see like what kind of, like, if they don't have words, what do they have? They can understand things, like in a way they can understand words before they can speak them, but that's something else.
Right. That's true. Like they'll respond to certain, like a dog.
Yeah, somewhat, but yeah, but of course they'll quickly develop because then they can do this conceptual stuff to then remember and expand their consciousness.
I think we discussed some of this when I clarified the CCD. Off topic, I want to ask you about personality. Have you given it any thought to what do you think personality is?
I always hate answering that one. Like, it's such a vague term, even in psychology. It's just consistent characteristics. But what is that ultimately? And I mean, I like to say sense of life, but that's still almost the same question. Like, what is it still? It's more like, I guess more like your style of thinking usually, or style of interacting with the world. It's very vague though. It's probably one of the most vague concepts in psychology, and I'm not even sure how to define it myself. Just
Oh, really?
what makes
Okay.
you you. I mean, that's the most vague thing I could say, but they're just consistent characteristics usually, like not one-off things, but things that are consistent about you.
Yeah, I was thinking about it. I even looked up the OED definition, and I asked my friend yesterday, and she said there's one measure is ocean, openness,
Yeah,
conscientiousness, air.
extroversion.
Yeah, whatever the next one. A is, I don't know what the other ones are, but
A is, well, there's neuroticism and
oh, okay.
openness to experience.
Um, yeah, I mean, I guess sense of life is part of it, but I need to think of examples, but I also think of personality now that I've looked up definitions as maybe more broad because it
Yeah,
might include like, um, me liking, I don't know, certain foods or something like that. Maybe
yeah.
I don't
Even
actually.
genetic,
I don't know if it
even
includes it.
genetics to an extent.
Right. And then
Freud.
what about character? How do you think about character versus personality?
I think of it as the same,
Yeah.
although some people use it to mean character as in their moral traits. But I
Yes.
use it more broadly personally.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Um, it's something I'm thinking about because I was trying to see if I could. I was getting my head around sense of life, and I was like, well, what does this thing actually like? Is this a thing or is it just personality? And so I was looking up the definitions, and I'm still kind of thinking about it, but
Mm-hmm.
um, can skip this because I think I need to go through these again, which I haven't. Okay, skip that. Um, so maybe we can look at this. The formation of a concept provides man with the means of identifying not only the concretes he observed, but all concretes of the kind that he may encounter in the future. Um, so this is like a principle, right? There's something similar here in forming concepts and in using principles. Like it allows you to deal with another one of those. That's the way Ray Dalio puts it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a common thing within objectivism. I think that the cognitive value of something is how it can allow you to broaden your thinking into the future, widening your ability to think.
Yeah, that's interesting. So then, at principle is just um, a proposition, a
Yeah.
proposition with concepts that are put together to help you deal with another one of those.
Yeah. That sounds about
Okay.
right.
Okay, cool. Um, okay, let's see what this says. Okay, so she is actually saying that some of our concept formation is automatic.
Yeah.
In anything like man, table, blue, all of that is automatic. Remember a while ago saying I don't remember forming cup.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, I read that in the Brandon book too. Like,
uh,
she definitely believes it. Like, it's more or less automatic at that level. There's nothing you really do, it just happens. Just in science, we could figure out how, but really, she just takes it for granted. Just it's automatic. That's that. There's nothing to say. But what she wants to focus on is the more abstract volitional aspects,
right,
using
which
those
one?
perceptual stuff to then build on those specifically.
Yes, which makes sense because like I was thinking these are easy, right? And I was like, well, but then it's true that when you get to the more abstract, gets really messy.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, that's the answer to that. Do you think that would make the case for many skills being non-volitional? For example, basketball, video games, things like that, because their perception, they're not, there's way less of the like abstractions from abstractions. There's way more of the perceptual, level abstractions or whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, of the specific skills, yeah. I mean, of course, you could learn what circumstances better promote that automatic learning. You can know what situations to put yourself in to promote your learning.
Right.
But no, you couldn't form the concept itself just by with volition. You have to just put yourself in the right situation and hope it turns out well.
Yeah. I hope your subconscious does the work for you and
Yeah,
your body.
otherwise, yeah. But
Yeah.
fortunately, it does work a lot of the time. Just that's what your cerebellum does. That's really what those automatic stuff usually. That's where it goes on usually.
But then I'm asking this because I'm curious, like at what point, let's say you want to compete in video games and you just can't beat other players. You just can't win. I don't play video games, but let's say you do. You just can't seem to like get it in the sense that you can't get to a high level for whatever reason. Other players just massively exceed you. At that point, did you say, oh, there's something my subconscious doesn't properly integrate and it's non-volitional, so I should just quit? That's
I think very often there's strategy involved in a way that you might recognize some limitations, but notice some strategy that makes you dominate the rest somehow. I mean, it depends on the game and how well the game is designed, but usually
yeah,
well-designed games can allow you to compensate in some way or another. That if you might be lacking in some, like say how fast you click,
yeah,
you might exceed in say strategic thinking,
right.
like minimize your clicks to even need in the first place.
Right. Right. Okay. Interesting.
Or like playing card games, like I mean poker, like at some level it's just there's just conceptual stuff going on. You're reasoning about how to say trick your opponent, make induce certain feelings in them, make them lose confidence or things like that can make you take over in other ways. That's where the conceptual part can come in.
Yeah, poker's trickier because you're kind of estimating if you're a good player, because I used to play online poker, you're estimating the range of hands they might have, which I don't know if that's even I don't know how that is first level or not first level. So
Yeah, probably
like
not.
that's more of the Iowa gambling task type thing
Yeah.
of just getting like you've got to have a lot of conceptual knowledge there. So it's a combination actually, but I don't know which. Yeah, it's really hard to say. I
I
don't
mean,
know.
clearly the more abstract you get, the less reliant you are even on the perceptual things like in chess. Like there's almost that's almost completely abstract. So
Right,
it's never about like these automatic things. It's more about
right,
how you've taught yourself strategy and different concepts within chess that
right,
enable you to really well. And
right,
that's how the amazing grandmasters do it because they learn how to conceptualize different moves. They remember moves better. They remember chessboards better. They just remember everything better because they have the concepts to refer to them, like different strategies. Oh, this is like the opening gambit or something, and they have a name for it. But you and I have nothing. Like to me, any starting move is just as good as another. They all have the
yeah,
same name. It's just first move. But
right.
really good chess players have names for it, almost for every kind of opening. Even things that I think, why do you even have a name for that? But for them, it matters, and that it allows them to think even more into the future, and it allows them to think, I don't know, 10 moves ahead. I don't even know how to do that, but grand chess masters do that.
Yeah. Do you think that when people, because I remember reading something about them saying like high level chess players chunk and so they can remember and see way more. That's conceptualization? I assume chunking is the
Yeah, I
same
mean,
thing.
how do you put it into a chunk? Well, they have the concepts to do that.
And then there's a range, because how can you predict, if you're talking about a range opening moves and seeing 10 moves ahead, like there are so many different things your opponent can do. So like it must be some kind of like concept with a range of different responses from your opponent. And somehow they just managed to capture like so many different ranges of moves and put in one concept. That's interesting. I don't know how that
Yeah,
works.
I mean,
So
and some statistical stuff going on subconsciously a little bit. But
What's
you got
that?
some, I mean,
Like
as in
Iowa
like,
gambling task type thing.
yeah, just pretty like what is he most likely to do 5 moves
Right.
ahead? I mean, you could see what they'll be forced to do and compare that with what options do they have.
Yeah.
So it's really able to hold as much as you can at once.
Yeah.
Inducting does help.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. Um, oh, this is when I got to concepts of consciousness.
Yeah. Most of that's just about intensity. That's the primary measurement she uses. The intensity of your anger, the intensity of your love, or intensity of your sadness, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I was kind of confused. Does the CCD say anything about the genus? The CCD is just the way you select the distinguishing characteristic. Is it? Or what's the relationship
I mean, it's
between the?
just the measurement. The CCD is just a measurement that's in common. That's all it is. So it's not necessarily a genus. It could be, but I don't think it usually is. I mean, just like shape, color, whatever.
Yeah.
Those
Okay.
are the CCDs. And if you could have a genus that's a color, sure, but otherwise, no.
What's what would you say the genus of mental activity is? Because I use that as the genus for thought when I was trying to like write about what thought is.
Well, what's more broad than mental activity? I don't know. I mean, is it going on? I mean, I don't know. I mean, an event or biolog or self-directed
Is it
event?
because
No, I
I
don't like that
can't? Well,
either.
no, it's not because it's not thought. Is genus is mental activity is broader than self-directed. Self-directed would be the thought, and
Yeah,
then that would be the definition for the thought.
right.
But the reason I ask is like I try to write down some concepts and then do the genus, but I'm often stuck. Like I can't connect the genus to anything else, and I wonder like am I supposed to be able to reach like constantly? Should I get to the axioms eventually? Is that what happens if you keep going up the genus? Or
Yeah,
uh, oh,
you get
I
just
should
to
be able to get to
existence.
consciousness, existence, and or entity or whatever.
Yeah, you should. I mean,
I
at that
should.
point, you might just say characteristic is more characteristic of entity. I mean, maybe that would be the genus because at some point you're just going to need to go like to entity. I mean, there's nothing wrong
Yeah.
with doing that.
Well, I'm stuck on a lot of them. I can't get there. I don't know what the genus like mental activity. I wouldn't know what the it
I
gets
mean,
messy.
verb is good enough. I think if you really just an activity, you can almost do it that way. I mean,
Action.
mental activities are types of activities.
Action is an attribute. Attribute is the genus of attribute is. I don't even know.
Um, Attributes are maybe identity. I mean, that's what I would go to almost like any attributes and identity of something.
Oh yeah. Oh,
And
okay.
then you just add identity, then you're at existence.
But I'm
You
not
can
confident
skip some.
on mental
Yeah,
activity, the verb
it
for that.
doesn't need to be
It
always
yeah.
linear, but I mean, as long
Yeah.
as you're just going more broad, I mean, then you could just think about later, like, oh, do I want something in between?
Right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I see what you're saying. So it doesn't matter if I'm a little bit mistaken and I skip a few or whatever. It just as long as I'm clear on like eventually getting to identity or whatever, then there's
I
some
mean, fill in
progress
the
to.
gaps as you go if you want. If you notice a gap, then fill it in. If it's not causing any issues, it's fine sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.